And the other thing in that, our biggest focus and our biggest advantage, we always focus on the, I'm going to use somewhat of a technical term, horsepower under the curve.
Okay. Never heard that before.
So it's if you go put an engine on a dyno, just straight up an engine, your engine produces horsepower in a curve. Okay.
Seen that on a dyno before.
Me?
Dyno sheet.
I've never seen a dyno sheet before.
All right.
Oh,
So
okay.
they'll-
All right.
So this is
there you go.
your engine does not. I mean, if you have a 400 horsepower engine, that's 400 horsepower at a given RPM. Let's say it's 8,000 because we're
Yep.
working in snowmobiles. That would be a really powerful one, but they exist. That's at 8,000 RPM. But at 3,000 RPM, that engine doesn't make 400 horsepower.
Yep.
It only makes 160. So you have this curve. Now, when you take and add clutching to it, that curve changes. Same thing. You don't have 100% of that horsepower at 0 miles an hour. Your clutching will come in and create its own curve. Now, the problem is sometimes that curve doesn't match the engine. Now, you can't make more horsepower than your engine's making. But what we focus on is generating or is grabbing that horsepower as early as possible and holding it as long as possible. So a lot of our competitors' horsepower dyno charts will look like a mountaintop.
Yep.
Ours look like a plateau. So our peak output isn't always more. We're usually within 2 or 3 horsepower because they're hitting peak. The engine's producing that much power at the peak. You're probably not. You can shift it a little bit, but you're not going to make a massive amount more. But in between,
You're holding that.
we're holding it.
So you just explained that really good. Okay. Because I was struggling a little bit, and that last little section that you just explained just,
So that's the horsepower under the curve that you're talking
Yeah.
about,
Yeah.
right?
yeah,
It's
that was great.
underneath there. There's way more horsepower in the
Yeah,
average.
it's underneath the very peak horsepower. And CVTs, that's the beautiful thing about CVTs, is they are designed to hold peak power
Yep.
as long as possible. And that's peak power of the engine. If the engine's got, 400 horse here and 300 here and 200 here, you're not going to make 400 horse here.
Yep.
You're going to make 200 there, 300 here, and 400 here. So what we try to do is get it to peak power at that RPM as quick as possible. And what we've come to, because there's a lot of guys, especially with the new UTV that just came out, they were like, oh, this dual clutch transmission is just going to kill a belt. Well, there's enough evidence out there now that it's not exactly like that, due to the fact that with a CVT, you start out in such a low range gear because obviously it's the tiniest sprocket in the front and the biggest one in the back. And so they come out of the hole really hard. And that's what we try to focus on, especially because the whole snowmobile industry, especially mountains, have transitions towards tree riding. In his generation, it was the most horsepower and shoot straight up a hill. And
Scare
I
yourself.
think our generation doesn't have cojones to do that because we like the trees. We like the trees. So ours is,
We also like the views.
yes.
Yeah.
And the views
Yeah, exactly.
are a little bit different. Yeah.
So keep getting the horsepower
More
as fast as we can, get into peak horsepower of that motor at every given RPM is what we focus on.
Yeah.
So we might run 2 horsepower under our competitors or 2 horsepower over, but we're going to hold it longer.
Enjoying the benefits of that horsepower for a much longer time rather
Right.
than just getting a little bit more at a very
this-
small time.
window. Yeah.
So this curve for when you're talking track speed essentially is on an engine dyno, you're looking at it versus RPM, so your engine RPM. On a track or wheel dyno, generally you're looking at it as speed, vehicle speed when you're working with a CVT. And the reason for that is a CVT's goal is to get it to peak horsepower, like he said. So let's use 8,000 as we referenced before, as quickly as possible. Well, a lot of times, especially when you get in the turbo world, you'll find them really sluggish. They don't reach that 8,000 until they're doing, say, 25 miles an hour. Whereas we will hit 8,000 at 10, and then we will hold it. And then a lot of times you'll see RPM fall off or gain. And gaining RPM, a lot of people think more RPM better. No,
Not always.
not always. You have to the piping and the engine itself has to be developed to run that RPM, or it doesn't make more power.
Yeah.
So we want to hold that as flat as possible for every given speed. And most people don't realize it. They'll look at it, and you'll look at competitors, and they'll make peak horsepower at 70 miles an hour. That's cool. How often are you at 70?
Yeah. Not so, especially when you're riding mountains, right?
Mountains.
Like, never.
If you are, you have a fast sled.
Yeah.
You have a fast sled.
So one of the other things that I think that they've done with their clutching kit that is important to mention is you start with the horsepower dyno of the engine.
Mm-hmm.
Now we understand the dynamics of the engine, and now you can load the clutch according to what that horsepower number is. Then when they have these transitions that we spoke about earlier of shifting, peak horsepower is generally, not always, but generally is related to a higher RPM than peak torque. So with the clutching, you want to stay up there close to that peak horsepower, and when you go into a heavier load like deep snow or a transition into a steep hill, you don't want to fall under peak torque, or all of a sudden you really lose whatever advantage your engine has over the buddy you're trying to beat right there.
Yep.
So you want to stay in between, because your torque number is always a lower RPM than your horsepower.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to come up, you want to run right in between them, where if you lose a little bit of RPM, and that's what we focus on, is our back shift, is that when you hit, like, buddy goes across the hill like that, you got to jump a trench. When you hit down hard, your track gets extra load.
Yep.
We focused with our helix, learning about how secondaries work, is we focused on our helix to backshift faster, and so it'll hold. We drop maybe
Get into
100.
that lower gear quick.
Yeah,
Yep.
we got it. It needs to go to lower gear, and then it'll come back up, right? Whereas a lot of what I've watched videos and stuff, we'll see guys pull RPM down 200-300 RPM, and yeah, they don't really pull below the torque, but they lose a lot of horsepower, if you will. They lose a lot of torque by dropping, way down that far. And so we focused on trying to make it so that you don't really lose RPM.
Yeah.
So that's kind of,
And one of the things we've noticed more recently, especially, like I say, I keep referencing turbos because turbos have a very bizarre power characteristics. You have no power, and then you've got all the power. So you have a really strange power characteristic you have to work with, and we're using profile to attack that.
Mm-hmm.
That's the shape of the weight. I've noticed a lot of our competitors are purposely over revving the engine to make up for a lack of profile. And you'll see, you can even hear it sometimes. They're climbing a hill, and pop, pop, pop. You can hear them whacking a rev limiter because they're trying to keep the tree characteristics as good as possible, and they're massively sacrificing the hill climb characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
With the technology that we use, we call it advanced profile technology, both in the helix and the primary. We focus on developing the shape of the weight to handle both situations.